August of 1983 was not a forgiving month in Braxton County. The sun had baked the clay soil into a network of fine cracks that looked like a map of a place no one wanted to go. The creeks had retreated into their deepest channels, leaving behind bleached stones and the faint, sad smell of drying algae. Corn in the fields had turned to brittle, papery brown weeks ahead of schedule, its tassels hanging like the frayed ends of old rope. The cicadas, usually a steady, humming backdrop to the summer, had grown frantic and shrill, their buzzing rising and falling with the waves of heat that shimmered over the asphalt roads. It was a listening time, a waiting time. The land was holding its breath. Arthur Penn felt it in his bones. At 72, his body was a reliable barometer for the moods of the land he had worked his entire life. He had been born in the same clapboard house he now lived in alone, and he intended to die there. The 200 acres of his farm were not the richest in the county, nor the flattest, but they were his. He owed no man a dollar for any piece of it, a fact that was both his quiet pride and, in the eyes of some, his defining eccentricity. He ran a small herd of Hereford cattle, about 30 head, and kept a garden that provided most of what he ate. He did not own a new tractor. His was a 1952 Ford 8N, its red and gray paint faded to a soft patina, its engine turning over with a familiar, rhythmic cough he understood better than most men understood their own hearts. He was a man of routines. His day began before the sun, with the metallic scrape of the coffee percolator on the stove. He would sit on the back porch, a heavy ceramic mug warming his hands, and watch the sky lighten from charcoal to violet to a pale, dusty blue. He watched the deer emerge from the wood line to drink from the stock tank. He watched the barn swallows begin their acrobatic patrols. He listened. The land spoke in a language of bird calls and wind direction and the way the dew settled on the clover. It was a language he had learned from his father and his father from his grandfather. It was not a language taught in agricultural colleges. The most peculiar part of Arthur's routine, the part that had long been a subject of conversation at the Braxton County Farmers Co-op, was his flock of Guinea hens. There were nearly 200 of them. They were not kept in a neat, fenced-in run like chickens. They were a semi-wild, chaotic force of nature that Arthur managed with a quiet, almost invisible hand. Each morning, after his coffee, he would walk to the 3 mobile roosting coops he had built himself from salvaged lumber and chicken wire. He would open their doors, and the birds would pour out in a chattering, speckled river. They were nervous, flighty creatures, with featherless blue heads and bodies shaped like teardrops covered in a galaxy of white spots on a dark gray background. Their calls were a constant, grating cacophony, a series of sharp, staccato barks that sounded like a piece of rusty machinery being cranked over and over. To most people, it was the sound of madness. To Arthur, it was the sound of work being done. The problem began subtly, over on Frank Miller's place, 5 miles to the east. A calf, just weaned, went down. It was listless, feverish, its gums a pale, sickly white. Frank called the vet, a young man named Peterson who was still trying to earn the trust of the old-timers. Peterson diagnosed it as pneumonia, gave it a shot of penicillin, and told Frank to keep it isolated. 2 days later, the calf was dead. A week after that, 2 more of Frank's heifers were stumbling, their heads hanging low. This time, Peterson drew blood. He sent it to the state lab. The diagnosis came back a week later. Anaplasmosis. Tick fever. It was not an unknown disease, but it was rare to see it hit so hard. The men at the co-op talked about it over bags of sweet feed and 10-penny nails. They blamed the mild winter. They blamed the dry summer. The drought had forced the deer, the primary host for the Lone Star tick, to congregate around the few remaining sources of water, concentrating the ticks in the pastures that bordered the woods. The cattle, weakened by the poor forage and the heat, were easy targets. Soon, it was not just Frank Miller's problem. It was on the Henderson place. It was on the Collier farm. The stories became a grim refrain in the county. A prize bull lost. A milk cow, dry and gaunt, that had to be put down. The cattle grew thin, their coats dull and rough. They were lethargic, unwilling to move from the shade of the few remaining live oaks. When they were forced to walk, you could see them, the ticks clustered in the soft skin around their eyes and ears, under their tails. They were swollen, grayish-brown spheres, gorged on the lifeblood of the herds. The county was in the grip of a quiet, creeping plague. Farmers responded as they always had. They bought pesticides. They ran their cattle through dipping vats filled with a milky, chemical-smelling solution. They used sprayers attached to their tractors to coat the animals directly. The air in the valley took on a sharp, acrid odor that overpowered the scent of dry hay and dust. The treatments worked for a few days. Then the ticks would be back. The cycle of dipping and spraying was expensive, it was labor-intensive, and it was hard on the cattle. The chemicals made their eyes water and their skin itch. But it was the only thing anyone knew to do. It was the modern way. This crisis, this slow-motion disaster, was what brought Mark Jensen to Braxton County. He was the new, young face of the State University Agricultural Extension Office. He was 28 years old, with a master's degree in agricultural science and a belief in data, charts, and chemical solutions that was as fervent as any religion. He drove a new, county-issued Ford F-150, its white paint still gleaming, a stark contrast to the dust-caked pickups that filled the co-op parking lot. He wore pressed khaki pants and a polo shirt with the university logo stitched on the breast. He carried a leather-bound portfolio and a clipboard. He had come to solve their problem. Jensen called a meeting at the Grange Hall. Nearly every farmer in the county showed up. They were worried men, their faces etched with the lines of sleepless nights and mounting debt. Jensen stood at the front of the room, a slide projector humming beside him. He clicked through slides showing magnified images of Amblyomma americanum, the Lone Star tick. He showed charts of infestation rates and transmission vectors. He spoke with a confident, reassuring tone about integrated pest management, a term that was new to most of the men in the room. His solution was a three-pronged attack. First, a more aggressive, state-recommended dipping schedule using a new, more powerful acaricide called amitraz. Second, a strict pasture rotation plan to break the tick's life cycle. Third, a targeted application of a granular pesticide called permethrin along the wood lines and fence rows where the tick populations were highest. It was a scientific plan, a modern plan. It was also an expensive one. The cost of the new chemicals, he explained, would be offset by the reduction in livestock losses. He handed out pamphlets with application rates and supplier information. Arthur Penn sat in the back row, listening. He did not ask any questions. He had seen men like Jensen before. They came with degrees and clipboards, full of certainty. They saw the land as a machine, a system of inputs and outputs that could be controlled with the right formulas. They could tell you the nitrogen content of the soil down to a decimal point, but they could not tell you where the water ran underground after a heavy rain. They knew the Latin names for pests, but they did not know the names of the birds that ate them. When the meeting was over, Arthur folded the glossy pamphlet and put it in his pocket. He did not intend to read it again. A few days later, Mark Jensen's white truck pulled into Arthur's lane. Jensen had a list of every registered cattle farm in the county, and he was making his rounds, promoting his plan, assessing compliance. He found Arthur by the old barn, greasing a bearing on his sickle bar mower. Arthur wiped his hands on a red rag and nodded a greeting. "Mr. Penn," Jensen said, extending a hand. His grip was firm, practiced. "Mark Jensen from the Extension Office. Just wanted to stop by and see how you were faring with the tick situation." "Getting by," Arthur said. The words were plain, offering nothing more. Jensen's eyes scanned the farm. He saw the old tractor, the faded barn, the small, healthy-looking herd of Herefords grazing peacefully in the far pasture. He did not see a dipping vat. He did not smell the sharp scent of chemicals. Then he heard it, the dissonant, chattering chorus of the Guinea hens as they foraged along the edge of the woods. "That's quite a flock of birds you have there," Jensen said. There was a note of amusement in his voice, the kind of tone one uses for a child's peculiar hobby. "Are they for eggs?" "Meat. They're for work," Arthur said. He turned his attention back to the mower, fitting the grease gun onto another Zerk fitting. Jensen smiled, a patient, condescending smile. "Right. Well, I left you one of my pamphlets at the meeting. The county is recommending a full course of amitraz dip and a permethrin treatment for the pasture perimeters. It's really the only way we're going to get ahead of this thing. Your herd looks healthy now, but you're surrounded by infested properties. It's only a matter of time. Arthur finished with the grease gun and wiped his hands again. He looked at Jensen. His gaze was level, unblinking. It was the gaze of a man who had spent a lifetime watching things grow, a gaze full of a patience that the younger man could not begin to comprehend. "I have my own program," Arthur said. Jensen's smile tightened. He saw an old man, stubborn, set in his ways, probably unable to afford the proper treatments. He felt a pang of pity for him. "Mr. Penn, I understand. Tradition is important, but this is a serious biological event. Folklore isn't going to solve it. We have scientific data. I can help you with the paperwork for a low-interest loan to cover the cost of the chemicals, if that's an issue." "I'm not in need of a loan," Arthur said. The statement was flat, a closing door. The conversation was over. Jensen could feel it. He made one last attempt. "All right, well, think about it. We're trying to get 100% participation for this to be effective. We don't want any reservoir farms where the ticks can survive and reinfest the whole county next year." He let the word reservoir hang in the air, a subtle accusation. Arthur just nodded. As Jensen walked back to his truck, the Guinea hens, startled by some unseen threat in the grass, erupted in a fresh wave of panicked, grating calls. Jensen shook his head and chuckled to himself. An old man and his noisy chickens. He got in his truck, made a note on his clipboard next to Arthur Penn's name. Non-compliant. Elderly. Potential reservoir. Follow up. He drove away in a cloud of dust, confident in his science, his plan, and the inevitability of the old man's failure. The talk at the co-op, which had been about the severity of the tick problem, now shifted to include the foolishness of Arthur Penn Frank Miller. His face grim from the loss of a half-dozen calves was particularly vocal. "He's sitting over there with those damn birds while the rest of us are going broke fighting this thing. It's not right. His ticks will be on my land next. Jensen says he's a reservoir." Another man added, glad to have a new, official-sounding word for his grievance. That's what he called it. A reservoir. They painted a picture of him as a stubborn old fool, a relic from a bygone era who was too proud or too ignorant to accept modern help. They saw his debt-free farm not as a sign of wisdom and frugality, but as evidence that he was out of touch, not invested in the progress of the community. His quiet self-reliance was recast as a dangerous, selfish isolation. The chattering of his Guinea hens, which had once been a mere local curiosity, was now the sound of irresponsibility. They pitied him. They resented him. They did not, for a moment, consider that he might be right. Arthur heard the whispers. He was not a recluse. He bought his flour and his salt at the co-op like everyone else. He felt the shift in the way the men looked at him. He saw the pity in their eyes, the frustration. It did not anger him. It did not move him at all. He had lived long enough to know that the opinions of other men were like the summer wind, loud for a time, and then gone. The land remained. The truth of the land remained. That evening, sitting on his porch as the sun bled across the western hills, he did not think about Mark Jensen or the men at the co-op. He thought about his father, Samuel Penn. He was a tall, spare man, with hands that were as gnarled and strong as oak roots. He had spoken little, but when he did, his words were like smooth, heavy stones that settled deep in your mind. The memory came to him clear as day. It was the summer of 1948. Arthur was 17. There had been a plague of grasshoppers that year. They had moved in a great, chewing wave across the county, leaving fields of corn and alfalfa stripped to the stalk. Everyone was buying arsenic bait, a poison-laced bran mash that they spread by the bucketful. It killed the grasshoppers. It also killed chickens, songbirds, and a neighbor's dog that had gotten into a treated field. Samuel Penn had bought no poison. Instead, he had borrowed a flock of turkeys from a cousin, nearly 100 of them. He had penned them in the afflicted fields using temporary fencing, moving them every few days. Arthur remembered the sight, the big birds moving in a disciplined line across the alfalfa, their heads bobbing, their sharp eyes missing nothing. They had devoured the grasshoppers. His father's fields were the only green ones left in the valley. Arthur had asked him that evening, right here on this same porch. "Why didn't you use the bait, Pa?" Everyone else did. His father had taken a long pull from his water dipper. He had looked out at the fields, at the turkeys settling in for the night. He had been quiet for a long time. Then he had spoken, his voice low and steady. "The land has its own army, Arthur. Most folks just don't know how to call it up. You see a problem, a pest, and you think you need to kill it with something from a sack. You think you're fighting the pest, but you're not. You're fighting the land itself. You're telling it that its own ways are wrong." He had pointed a long, calloused finger toward the field. "Those birds, they're part of the system. The grasshoppers, they're part of it too. When one gets out of balance, you don't bring in poison from the outside. Poison doesn't know when to stop. It kills the problem, and then it kills the solution to the next problem you haven't even seen yet. No, you find another part of the system and you make it stronger. You don't fight a fire with gasoline. You fight a pest with its predator. The land has its own army. You just have to feed it and point it in the right direction." That was the core principle. It was the central truth upon which Samuel Penn had built his farm, and upon which Arthur now maintained it. The land was not a factory to be managed with chemicals and machines. It was a living, breathing, complex community. To solve a problem within that community, you had to understand the relationships between all its members. The ticks were not an isolated enemy. They were a symptom of an imbalance. The modern solution was to declare war on the symptom. Arthur's way, his father's way, was to restore the balance. Arthur did not keep a handwritten notebook like some farmers. His knowledge was not stored on paper. It was stored in action, in routine, in the living, breathing system he managed every day. The 200 Guinea hens were his record. Their health was his ledger. Their presence was the physical manifestation of his father's principle. He knew their ways intimately. He knew that their eyesight was so keen they could spot a tick in the grass from 10 feet away. He knew they were voracious, indiscriminate eaters of insects, spiders, and other small creatures. A grasshopper, a beetle, a tick, it was all the same to a guinea's gullet. He knew they were territorial and would cover a vast amount of ground in a single day. A flock of 200, he had calculated long ago, could effectively patrol his entire 200 acres. But he did not just let them run wild. His system was more elegant than that. It was a deliberate, strategic deployment of the land's own army. While his neighbors were suiting up in respirators and rubber gloves to mix batches of amatraz, Arthur Penn began his day's work. His action was not a dramatic, sudden counterattack. It was the same quiet, methodical series of chores he performed every day. It was an act of faith in a system that had been working long before the first bag of permethrin had been manufactured. He started with the mobile coops. He had 3 of them, each housing about 65 birds. They were simple A-frame structures on heavy wooden skids, light enough to be dragged by his old Ford 8N. Each week, he would hook a chain to one of the coops and drag it 50 yards to a fresh patch of ground. This prevented the buildup of droppings and parasites around the roosting sites, and it ensured that the birds' intensive foraging was distributed evenly across the pastures over time. His tools were not shiny or new. They were the tools of a man who understood leverage and patience. He used the Ford 8N, its simple 3-point hitch, a marvel of engineering that had not been fundamentally improved upon in 40 years. He used a long steel pry bar to lift the corners of the coops if they got stuck on a rock. He used old galvanized steel waterers and feeders that he had patched with solder over the years. His most important tools, however, were the guineas themselves. The birds were a marvel of biological engineering. They were native to Africa, adapted for foraging in grasslands and savannas, an environment not unlike the dry, open pastures of Braxton County that summer. They had a social structure that made them perfect for the job. They foraged as a team, spreading out in a loose line, communicating with a constant stream of soft clicks and chirps. They moved through the grass, their heads down, their sharp eyes scanning the ground. When one found a source of food, a beetle, a cricket, a tick, it would let out a sharp, excited cry, and others would come running. Their most famous call, the one that grated on the nerves of his neighbors, was their alarm. Buckwheat, buckwheat. Buckwheat. They would shriek at the sight of a hawk, a fox, or a strange truck driving down the lane. They were the farm's sentinels, its early warning system. But to Arthur, their most important sound was the quiet, steady clicking of 200 beaks systematically stripping his pastures clean of pests. The process was a slow, deliberate dance between the cattle and the birds. Arthur practiced a form of rotational grazing that was decades ahead of its time. He divided his largest pasture into 4 smaller paddocks with a single strand of electrified wire. The cattle would graze one paddock for a week, their hooves churning the soil, their droppings fertilizing the ground. When he moved the cattle to the next paddock, he would move the guinea coops into the one they had just left. The birds would then perform their sanitation service. They would break apart the cowpats, eating the fly larvae and other insects that bred there. But more importantly, they would sweep the pasture for the ticks that had been dropped by the cattle. A female tick can lay thousands of eggs. The guineas consumed the females before they could lay, and they consumed the larval seed ticks that hatched from any eggs they missed. They were breaking the pest's life cycle at every stage. After a week, the guineas would have sanitized the paddock. It would then be left to rest for 3 weeks, allowing the grasses to recover, before the cattle were moved back in. It was a closed loop, a self-sustaining system of pest control and fertilization. The cattle fed the grass fed the cattle. The cattle fed the ticks, and the ticks fed the guineas. The guineas protected the cattle. Every part of the system supported the others. It was the embodiment of his father's wisdom. Mar Jensen would sometimes drive past Arthur's farm on his way to a more compliant property. He would see the flock of birds scattered across a field, moving in what appeared to be a completely random pattern. He would see Arthur out on his old tractor, dragging one of the shabby-looking coops. It looked like the work of an eccentric, not the methodical application of a sophisticated biological control strategy. He would shake his head, make a mental note that Penn was still holding out, and press the accelerator, leaving the quiet, effective solution behind in his rearview mirror. The men at the co-op continued to talk. Saw old man Penn out in his field again today, one would say, leaning against a stack of feed sacks, just standing there, watching those birds. It's a sad thing to see a man lose his touch. He's breeding 1,000,000 ticks over there is what he's doing. Another would grumble, scratching at a chigger bite on his arm. Jensen ought to do something. Quarantine the place. They saw chaos. They saw neglect. They saw stubborn foolishness. They could not see the intricate, patient order that lay beneath the surface. They were looking for the roar of a sprayer and the smell of chemicals, the signs of a conventional war being waged. Arthur's quiet, biological peacekeeping was invisible to them. By late September, the situation in the rest of Braxton County had grown dire. The first round of treatments had failed. The second was proving only marginally more effective. The ticks, it seemed, were developing a resistance to the amitraz. Jensen, looking at his discouraging data, advised the farmers to shorten the interval between dippings. The cattle, already stressed by the heat and poor forage, were now being subjected to a chemical bath every 10 days. The costs were becoming ruinous. The chemicals were expensive. The labor was intensive, and the cattle were still dying. Frank Miller had lost nearly a third of his herd. The Collier farm, which ran on a much tighter margin, was rumored to be on the verge of bankruptcy. The mood in the county had soured from worry to a kind of grim, exhausted despair. The men at the co-op no longer talked much at all. They just loaded their trucks with the chemicals that weren't working and drove home, their faces set like stone. It was during this time that the first signs of Arthur's success began to become undeniable, at least to those who were willing to look. His 30 head of Herefords were a picture of health. Their coats were slick and shiny. Their eyes were bright. They grazed with a placid contentment that had vanished from every other herd in the county. They were not clustered in the shade. They were spread out across the pasture, their tails swishing lazily, unbothered. One of his neighbors, a man named George Caldwell, whose land bordered Arthur's to the south, was the first to notice. George had lost 4 cows in a month. He was a quiet man, not one for the gossip at the co-op. One afternoon, driven by a desperate curiosity, He walked the fence line he shared with Arthur. On his side, the grass was crawling with ticks. He could see them on the stems of the Johnson grass, waiting with their front legs outstretched. On Arthur's side, there was nothing. He spent an hour walking that fence. He parted the grass with his hands. He checked the underside of leaves. He found a single, half-grown tick. The next day, George Caldwell swallowed his pride and walked up Arthur's lane. He found Arthur sharpening the blade of a hoe in his workshop. "Arthur," he said, twisting the brim of his hat in his hands. I was walking the fence line yesterday." Arthur stopped his work and looked at him. "George, your pasture," George said, his voice low. "It's clean. It's clean. Mine's eat up with them. I'm dipping every week, and it's doing no good. How are you doing it?" Arthur did not gloat. He did not say, "I told you so." He simply picked up a bucket of scratch grain and said, "Come with me." He led George out to the pasture where the guineas were working. He scattered the grain. The birds came running, their comical, bobbing gait a strange contrast to their relentless efficiency. Arthur pointed. "They're the ones doing it," he said. "They eat them, all day long. They don't miss much." George Caldwell stood there for a long time, watching the birds peck and scratch and move through the grass. He was seeing the farm not through the lens of co-op gossip, but with the desperate, clear eyes of a man on the brink of failure. He was seeing the system. He finally understood. "My pa," George said softly. He used to keep a few guineas, so they were good for snakes and bugs. "I always thought they were more trouble than they were worth. Too noisy." "The noise is part of the work," Arthur said. The story of George Caldwell's walk along the fence line began to spread. It was a small crack in the dam of the county's collective certainty. It was the first piece of anecdotal evidence that could not be easily dismissed. Mark Jensen heard the story, but he dismissed it as a fluke, an anomaly. Penn's farm, he reasoned, must have some unique geographical feature that made it less hospitable to ticks. A different soil type, better drainage. He wrote it off in his notes. He was too invested in his own plan, too blinded by his own data sets, to consider an alternative. He was a man with a modern hammer, and everything looked like a modern nail. But his own data was becoming impossible to ignore. His plan was failing. The tick population was not decreasing. It was stabilizing at a catastrophically high level. The cattle were not recovering. They were weakening further, their immune systems compromised by the constant stress and chemical exposure. He was getting angry calls from farmers. He was getting pressure from the state capitol. The confidence he had brought with him to Braxton County was eroding, replaced by a gnawing anxiety. He had an assistant, a young woman named Sarah Franklin. She had grown up in the county, and she was studying agronomy at the local community college. She was quiet, observant, and she did not share Jensen's unwavering faith in chemical solutions. It was her job to collect the field data, which meant she was the one who had to visit the farms and count the ticks on the cattle, a grim and disheartening task. She was the one who heard the farmers' stories of loss and frustration firsthand. "Mark," she said one afternoon in their small, cluttered office. They were looking at a spreadsheet that showed livestock mortality rates. The numbers were a sea of red. "Maybe we should go take a serious look at Arthur Penn's place." "We know about Penn's place," Jensen said irritably, not looking up from the screen. "He's non-compliant. He's got birds. It's an anomaly." "But is it?" Sarah pressed, her voice gentle but firm. "George Caldwell's farm is right next door. Same soil type, same topography. His mortality rate is 28%. Mr. Penn's is 0. That's not an anomaly. That's a result." Jensen finally looked up. He saw the earnest, intelligent concern in her eyes. He was tired. He was out of ideas. His scientific certainty had crumbled. "What do you propose we do?" he asked, the question an admission of defeat. "Go ask him if we can count his chickens." "We could ask him if we could walk his pastures," Sarah said. "We could do a formal tick survey, a drag test, compare it to the Caldwell place. We need to quantify it. We need data. Isn't that what you always say?" She was using his own language against him. He sighed. He knew she was right. His current approach was a dead end. To ignore the only success story in the entire county, however unconventional, was no longer science. It was dogma. "All right," he said. "Set it up." So Mark Jensen, the man of science and progress, found himself driving his clean white truck down Arthur Penn's dusty lane for a second time. This time, he was not there to instruct. He was there, however reluctantly, to learn. He and Sarah found Arthur by the barn, just as he had before. "Mr. Penn," Jensen began, his tone stripped of its former easy confidence. "My assistant, Sarah Franklin. We were wondering if you would permit us to conduct a survey on your property. A tick drag. We'd like to collect some data on your infestation levels." Arthur looked from Jensen's tense face to Sarah's quiet, respectful one. He nodded once. "Help yourselves," he said. The process was simple. Sarah had a 1-meter square of white flannel cloth attached to a wooden pole with a rope. She dragged it behind her for 100 meters through the pasture, then stopped to count the number of ticks that had clung to the fabric. They performed 10 drags in one of Arthur's recently grazed paddocks. The total count, 6 ticks, 5 nymphs, and 1 adult male. Then they went next door and repeated the exact same procedure in George Caldwell's pasture, just across the fence. The difference was staggering. After the first 10 meters, the white cloth was peppered with black and brown specks. After 100 meters, it was crawling with them. They stopped counting after the first drag, when the number had surpassed 200. Mark Jensen stared at the cloth. He felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach. The visual evidence was irrefutable. It was a statistical sledgehammer to the foundations of his education. Everything he had been taught, everything he had preached to the farmers of Braxton County, was wrong. And the proof of his error was a 72-year-old man with an 80-year-old idea. He stood there in the silent, shimmering heat, the frantic buzzing of the cicadas suddenly sounding like mocking laughter. He had been so sure, so confident in his modern methods. He had pitted Arthur Penn. Now, standing amidst the evidence of his own catastrophic failure, he felt a profound and humbling shame. The climax of the crisis arrived not with a bang, but with a quiet, official-looking document. The State Department of Agriculture released its quarterly livestock census and loss report for Braxton County. The numbers were stark and brutal. The county had lost, on average, 17% of its adult cattle population to anaplasmosis and related complications in a single 3-month period. For some individual farms, the losses exceeded 30%. The total economic damage was estimated in the hundreds of thousands of dollars, a crippling blow to the small community. The report listed losses farm by farm. Miller, Frank, 22 head. Collier, James, 31 head. Caldwell, George, 18 head. The list went on, a litany of financial ruin. And then, at the bottom of the second page, was a single, anomalous line. Penn, Arthur, 0 head. The report was posted on the bulletin board at the co-op. The men who had mocked Arthur, the men who had called him a fool and a reservoir, stood and read it in silence. There was no more debate. There were no more theories. There was only the undeniable, black and white quantification of their failure and his success. The numbers did not lie. The math was simple and cruel. In his office, Mark Jensen did his own math. He calculated the total cost of his recommended program for an average 100-head herd, the price of the amitraz and permethrin, the man-hours for dipping and spraying, the fuel for the tractors. He added in the average 17% livestock loss at market value. The final number was staggering. Then he calculated Arthur Penn's costs. A few $100s a year for supplemental grain for the guineas. The initial one-time cost of building the mobile coops from salvage materials. A few hours of his own labor each week. The profit from selling a few dozen birds for meat each fall likely covered the grain bill entirely. Arthur's program was not just biologically superior. It was profoundly more economical. He had not only saved his herd, he had saved his farm from the crushing debt that now burdened his neighbors. Jensen had come to Braxton County promising a modern, efficient solution. He had delivered a modern, expensive failure. The old man, with his father's wisdom and his flock of noisy birds, had delivered an elegant, cost-free success. A week later, a different truck pulled into Arthur's lane. It was not the White County F-150. It was Mark Jensen's personal vehicle, a dusty, 10-year-old Chevrolet. He was not wearing his university polo shirt and khaki pants. He was wearing simple jeans and a work shirt. He did not have a clipboard. He found Arthur on the back porch, mending a piece of harness leather. Jensen stood at the bottom of the steps for a moment, shifting his weight. The easy confidence was gone, replaced by a deep, uncomfortable humility. "Mr. Penn," he said. His voice was quiet. "I came here to say I was wrong, and I came to apologize. I was arrogant. I didn't listen. I dismissed you, and I was wrong." Arthur looked up from his work. He studied the young man's face. He saw the genuine remorse there. He saw the collapse of a lifetime of certainty. He felt no triumph, no desire to rub salt in the wound. He simply nodded and gestured with his head to the other rocking chair on the porch. "Sit," he said. Jensen sat. For a long time, neither man spoke. The only sounds were the rhythmic scrape of Arthur's needle through the leather and the distant, chaotic chatter of the Guinea hens sweeping through the far pasture. It was the sound of a system in balance, a sound that Jensen was only just beginning to understand. Finally, Jensen broke the silence. "I need to understand," he said. "Not for a report. For myself. I need to understand how it works. How you knew." Arthur set down the harness. He looked out at the land, at the green of his pastures standing in stark contrast to the scorched, overgrazed fields of his neighbors. He did not launch into a long explanation. He did not gloat. He did what his father would have done. He showed, rather than told. "Let's take a walk," he said. They walked for nearly 2 hours. Arthur led Jensen through the paddocks, explaining the rotation. He pointed out how the cattle grazed and how the guineas followed. He kicked over a dried cow pad, revealing the tunnels of the dung beetles and the absence of fly larvae. "The birds take care of that," he said. He showed Jensen one of the mobile coops, explaining how moving it prevented disease and spread the birds' fertilizing manure. He pointed to the woods. "The ticks live on the deer. The deer come out to the edge of the pasture. The birds spend half their day patrolling the fence line. It's the first place they go in the morning and the last place they check before they roost." He explained the principle his father had taught him, the idea of the land's own army. "You came in here looking for a weapon," Arthur said, his voice plain, without accusation. "A poison to kill the enemy. I don't have an enemy. I have a system that's out of balance. The drought weakened the cattle and brought the deer in close. The tick numbers went up. That's a symptom. Your chemicals, they just fight the symptom. The birds, they don't just fight the symptom. They restore the balance. They're a part of the system, just like the ticks, just like the cattle." He stopped and picked a blade of fescue, chewing on the tender end. "Your science," he said, "it's a good thing. It knows how to take things apart. It can look at a tick and tell you its name and how it breeds and what poison will kill it. My father's way, it's about knowing how things fit together. It's not about killing one thing. It's about encouraging 100 other things that keep that one thing in its proper place." They walked back to the farmhouse in silence. Jensen's mind was reeling. He was reevaluating his entire education. He had been trained to see farming as a war against nature, a constant battle against pests, weeds, and drought. Arthur Penn saw it as a partnership. He was not a commander, imposing his will on the land. He was a steward, a conductor, gently guiding the complex orchestra of his farm back into harmony. Back at his office, Mark Jensen did something that took a great deal of professional courage. He took his meticulously prepared report on the failure of the chemical intervention program and he threw it in the trash. He rolled a fresh sheet of paper into his typewriter and began to write a new one. The title was Biological Pest Control in an Endemic Tick Zone, a case study of the Penn Farm, Braxton County. He wrote for 2 days. He detailed Arthur's system of rotational grazing. He described the symbiotic relationship between the cattle and the Guinea hens. He included the data from the tick drags, the official livestock loss reports, and his economic analysis. He did not frame Arthur's method as folklore or an anomaly. He framed it as a sophisticated, sustainable, and economically superior model of integrated pest management. He quoted Arthur's father, "You don't fight a fire with gasoline. You fight a pest with its predator." He sent the report to the state university. At first, it was met with skepticism. But the data was undeniable. His superiors, faced with the catastrophic failure of their own recommended program, had no choice but to take it seriously. A month later, Jensen received a call. The state was approving a pilot program based on his report. They were allocating funds to help a dozen farms in Braxton County establish their own flocks of guinea hens, build mobile coops, and implement Arthur's rotational system. They wanted him to lead it, and they wanted to know if Arthur Penn would be willing to act as a paid consultant. The knowledge was being adopted. The system was changing. The quiet wisdom of one old man, passed down from his father, was about to become official policy. The following spring, a new sound began to drift across the hollows of Braxton County. It was the strange, chattering call of the guinea hen. Small flocks, their numbers growing, could be seen moving through the pastures of the Miller Farm, the Collier Farm, the Caldwell Farm. The Braxton County Farmers Co-op, which had once been the epicenter of mockery, now had a new section dedicated to game bird feed and poultry fencing. The conversations had changed. Men who had once called Arthur a fool now sought his advice on how to raise Keats and when to move their coops. Arthur, for his part, gave his advice freely and plainly, without a hint of triumph. The sound of the guinea hens became the new normal. It was no longer the sound of one man's eccentricity. It was the sound of a community's recovery. It was the sound of balance being restored. The chaotic noise that had once symbolized foolishness was now the symbol of a hard-won, practical wisdom. It was the sound of health. Sarah Franklin became the day-to-day manager of a new program. She spent at least one afternoon a week at Arthur's farm. She did not come with a clipboard or a checklist. She came to learn. She would help him into fence or watch him tend to a sick bird or just sit on the porch with him, listening. She was a bridge between the old world and the new. She understood Arthur's deep, intuitive knowledge, and she also knew how to translate it into the language of reports and grant proposals that the modern world required. She was the successor. She would ensure that the knowledge of Samuel and Arthur Penn would not be forgotten again. One evening, as she was preparing to leave, she stood with Arthur by the fence, watching his flock settle into their roosts for the night. The setting sun cast long shadows across the pasture. "You know," she said, "it's funny. For years, everyone in this county heard those birds and just thought they were noise. They never really listened." Arthur watched as the last of the guineas hopped up onto its roost. He thought of his father. He thought of the long, slow cycles of the land, of problems that seemed new but were in fact ancient. He thought of the simple, powerful truths that were so easily forgotten and had to be relearned generation after generation. "Some things don't get old," he said, his voice as quiet as the coming dusk. "They just wait. They wait for people to remember why they were put here in the first place."